IBM is the sponsor of our ebook series on the Docker and container ecosystem. Learn more about IBM's perspectives in our latest ebook about monitoring and management. It's available for download now at thenewstack.io. Hello, you're listening to a new episode of the New Stack Makers. Today we are talking about container monitoring. I'm Ben Ball. I'm joined today by Turk Isci, a researcher, master inventor, and team lead for cloud monitoring analytics at IBM. It's great to have you here, Turk.
Thank you very much, Pam. Great to be here.
So as I said already, we're talking about container monitoring. We've been working on the fifth ebook in our Docker and Container Ecosystem book series, the final book in this series, and it's final in a lot of interesting ways because monitoring is sort of one of the last components in the challenge of using containers in production. And it's been a very interesting thing for us to research and write about. And it seems like something that you're going to have a lot to say about. So I wondered if maybe you would maybe give us a little intro to what you do at IBM, what your role is, and sort of what you're working on right now.
Absolutely. As you mentioned in the introduction, I lead the cloud monitoring and analytics team in IBM. And for the last several years, we have been working on various techniques on how we build seamless and deep monitoring, and as we call it, operational visibility techniques for cloud, and focusing for about 2 years now very heavily on containers and leveraging some unique capabilities of containers. And as a group, what we have done is we have built solutions that provide great visibility, great understanding of how systems, how containers operate, how applications in them behave, and how the events surrounding them kind of impact their characteristics. And how we can use this deep understanding about containerized systems to actually build analytics on top. So some of the things we have recently been focusing on are around security analytics, but overall there are great opportunities looking at configurations, looking at operations, so on and so forth. So I think the possibilities are not endless probably, but there's a huge amount of possibilities to actually grow both the monitoring side and the analytics side for both containers and cloud in general.
Yeah, I'm very interested to kind of suss out what that landscape looks like to you. You mentioned security and the focus on security, and we're sort of coming off our fourth book, which had a lot to do with security. And so I'm very interested in knowing how monitoring fits into the security landscape. I know you've worked on Vulnerability Advisor. How do those topics kind of meld together? What is the overlap there?
I think that's a great question. So actually, for traditional reasons, when we think of monitoring, we think of pretty much metering and logging. But in reality, especially as systems kind of grow and become more complex and more social, interacting with many other systems, monitoring is much more than what we call metering and logging. Actually, anything like the way we kind of phrase this is, there are three aspects to system or application visibility. There is the state that encapsulates your system and applications, and that can include things like security posture, applications running configurations. It involves events, which are like the common go-to examples are logs, audit information, and there are others around this. And a third one, you could say maybe somewhat like metrics and things that kind of straddle between states and events, depending on how you look at them. So the overall monitoring or visibility into the system is a collection of this. And part of this is not just about the application you look at, but also its periphery, how it is interacting with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world, how the rest of the world is interacting with your application. Especially for containers and the growing trends around microservices, this becomes a big issue because most of these components are like super social. they talk to many other components. They are configured collectively. So when we talk about monitoring, we actually mean a lot more than just metering, logging, and the basic, resource utilization kind of things. And that has been the driving force behind everything we have built on. Actually, to give you some history, when we started working on containers monitoring, where we started was pretty much looking at metering and logging, because that was the obvious go-to example. But we believed this vision of thinking deep visibility into application systems and their environments is what should drive what we are doing. So we built the same logic to actually get us information that is beyond basic, well-known capabilities for used in traditional monitoring tools. And later on, this actually lent itself so nicely to extend what we were doing. We actually used the exact same components to build solutions around analytics. And the vulnerability advisor you mentioned is a first example of this, where using the same principles of operational visibility, you can actually build analytics that go beyond simple metering and dashboarding kind of solutions. So that's how we ended up kind of bridging the two worlds, which was kind of, I would say, like our intentions from day one. And as we kind of dig deeper into this space, we learned that there is a lot of opportunity to actually use visibility to do more than basic reporting, and actually build solutions that solve real world problems, real user problems and real provider problems.
Yeah, I'm very much not surprised to hear that it's so analytics driven, especially since we hear about this a lot from IBM. I mean, you guys are kind of the data analytics people, so it sounds like you specifically have been very involved in this, and I gave your role earlier as a master inventor and researcher. So it sounds like this is something that you've been working on both conceptually, but also how it applies for the end user, right? It seems like you're involved very deeply in not just how it works out of the box, but the very idea behind why we're doing this. So it's very interesting to me to kind of hear that background and what you've been working on and where it's headed towards. I do want to take a step back maybe and sort of, since we do focus so much on containers, and sort of ask what's different with containers. And I say it this way because traditional monitoring is sort of, I think a lot of people understand it or think they understand it. And introducing containers in the mix obviously changes a lot of other components, both for users and organizations. And that we've done a whole book series about this. But what does it change for monitoring?
Okay, so there is a lot actually. And there are some interesting opportunities and some newly emerging challenges. In terms of opportunities, what we find extremely useful is containers are a very nice encapsulation of how you run applications. And they are very much, they have two great potentials. One of them is basically building them, basically being very nicely integrated into DevOps cycle. So the modern way of developing software, doing it with containers, I would say probably if we spell out one, the Docker's, application packaging, build, ship, run approach turns out to be a great way of actually building applications that are deeply integrated in the DevOps cycle. And the other one is as an opportunity for containers, actually the encapsulation they provide is actually have great properties that it makes them very accessible. But I would say, like, simply, they are very easy to inspect. That gives you a lot of powers that you would otherwise have very difficulty actually leveraging. To give you an example, as I said, we have been working in this space, and I have this belief that traditional monitoring techniques that rely on agent-based piecemeal solutions are completely broken for cloud. And at VM's level, say a few years back, we have seen the beginnings of this. It has become difficult to kind of maintain a scales kind of crew where you would have a solution for performance monitoring, all with the Ganglias, Nagioses of the world, a solution for configuration management, solution for security compliance, so on and so forth. And you would have all these additional software components that you have to decorate your system with. And from traditional to VMs, we saw that that jump was kind of tolerable, but the cracks start to show up because maintenance became a huge deal. Scales kind of started to get in the way, and not as in the modern day cycle, but at VM cycles, you still start to iterate faster than you would do in native systems. So as we move to containers, we see that this completely breaks, because now you are thinking about containers gives me one concern per environment. I will design my applications as multiple components, each evolve and iterate independently. And somehow on top of that, I will build all this plumbing in traditional methods. It doesn't scale, and it actually cannot be maintained in terms of complexity. And on top of that, you are basically trying to build, what's a good analogy? You are trying to build a whole city around one store that tries to serve one thing. And basically you are saying, here is my fire station, here is my police, and all of you have to basically, if you want to build that store, you have to build all of that. Otherwise you won't be able to observe it. So with containers, we see that this approach breaks, but containers itself now lend themselves to a very nice framework where you can lift your, keeping the analogy, lift your store like one level up. Basically, everything, all the plumbing, all the policing, all the safety built under the covers for you. And containers just actually pop up on top. All they care about is their own operation, their own analytics. So that's one great opportunity. I think that makes a huge difference that we didn't have before. And in terms of challenges, I already mentioned some of them, but I think two things that makes great sense to reiterate. One of them is scale. The other one is the ephemeral nature. So a lot of the ephemeral nature, by that I mean, they, unlike traditional systems, now in this world, our applications come and go very rapidly. They scale up, they scale down, they fail over, they get redeployed much more frequently. So assuming static built-in plumbing mechanisms does not work, does not actually scale, or does not keep up with such dynamism. So in this world, you actually need a solution that kind of abstracts all that away. And you can think of containers as the new processes of the new modern OS, which is the cloud. And you don't today, if you said today, I will build my own bookkeeping, accounting, security checking for each of my processes in my operating system, people would call you insane. Maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it wasn't the case. But today, that is, I think, very obvious. You rely on the operating system, well-established context to do that for you. And you know that they will do it better than you. So now, the challenge for containers is similar kind of operation principles. So it kind of paves the way of what you should do. You are building the modern OS, and modern OS now comes with all these features. And a lot of these are around providing visibility, providing understanding, providing bookkeeping, providing safety. So this is, I think, what is different with containers. There is great opportunity to build a whole new city where all these stores just deal with their own kind of individual jobs. They don't deal with the rest of the world, because that is kind of infrastructure. You are just a member, you are just a citizen. So I don't know how long the analogy goes. I just made it up right now. So but that's what I think kind of overall what makes sense. And what else to say? I think one more thing I think that is very important, which is from our bringing up, we have this system-centric view of monitoring, of visibility today. So, okay, here is my CPU utilization, here is my thresholding, here is my alerting for my system. But when we talk containers, we again talk about a community, a society, right? We don't talk about, I have this lovely container and that solves all my problems. No, you actually have a distributed application, something that is composed of many, many members. And you basically have to think about distributed application-centric view, including the periphery, environment, configuration management, provisioning, all that as part of this environment, rather than just thinking about, okay, I have a container, let me see what's in it and what is the kind of, what it is using. So that, I think, is what is different in terms of containers, if we could call it a nutshell.
Yeah, I do think you did a really good job hitting on a lot of different complex changes, I think, here. And we're trying to encapsulate that as well. This is something where my question kind of is, so keeping all those changes in mind, is this something where existing solutions can easily adapt to these changes, or are they having to build kind of ground up new solutions even if those new solutions are integrating with existing ones to tackle these problems? How difficult is it to adapt?
Okay. Some of them are easy, some of them not so easy. So I have seen actually both trends. We see a lot of traditional APM and traditional monitoring solutions kind of nudging themselves into this world. Basically, containers becomes a me too. So they kind of extend their basic capabilities to kind of, we also do containers. And on top of that, we see kind of new grassroots solutions coming up saying, I will build a solution that specifically leverages container properties, specifically leverages overall build, deploy, run flow of containers and the key properties about how they interact with each other, how they are deployed, and how they are configured. So I see both of them happening. Overall, I can imagine we actually play on both sides of this equation, right? Because if you are working in the space, you have a lot of technical depth, technical baggage that you have actually built. So you have to naturally work on the above side of the saying, I will also support containers. So that part, what can I do to get the requirements met? That is, I see a lot of them happening. So that I think I would say to get that base capabilities done, it is doable, but it is not really differentiating in terms of what you can do. Under the covers though, if you look at the core principles and build solutions that leverage that, then you find a lot of interesting opportunities. You can actually now understand how group of containers work together, how they actually build from same configuration management, and how they actually utilize resources or do communications or present a security posture together. And you basically leverage what the containers provide. Things like I mentioned, like easy to inspect, the service-oriented model, or microservice-oriented model. So that part needs a little more thought, and we have seen this time and again. And part of that is also, as I said, you have to deal with very different notions of scale and dynamism that is built into how you actually present the overall view of what you think is the operational view of your system. So I think I answered both ways, but that I think is the reality.
Is this something where IBM is surfacing these changes in both approaches, basically adapting some solutions to be ready for that, building new solutions to address these same concerns, or maybe, yeah, just give me kind of an idea of how this is surfacing into IBM products.
Okay, that is, in IBM, I think the answer is yes to your question either way, right? So the IBM has a lot of solutions for various runtimes and various levels of complexity. So the part that I have been more involved with actually was the new container service that we have been building from ground up, and basically taking a containers first approach. So there we actually built all solutions in a, like some key properties were like, we actually leverage key container principles. We rely on open source technologies. We actually make the experience for the user both, very delightful, very simple to use, and on top of like familiar. On top of that, providing familiar capabilities. For example, the entire monitoring and logging service was built upon the ELK stack, and providing additional capabilities such as multi-tenancy, authorization, and certain, more recently, some capabilities around providing different levels of service. And under the covers, it was for the users. You don't even need to know what the implementation is. This looks familiar to you, and you just have to say yes or no, and maybe give us a few pointers about, I want to track this, I don't want to track this. So this is the approach we took from the container service, where it is first-class citizen. It is actually containers first, as we put it, to actually build a solution that leverages and kind of embraces the capabilities of containers.
So is that something where you're focusing mostly on application monitoring or containerized application monitoring, or is IBM kind of offering a wide variety of things or a wide variety of focuses?
IBM in general definitely offers a variety of solutions. Container service obviously focuses on containers. So I think that's the right way to answer that, because the IBM product portfolio is huge, right? So there are many, many other solutions that have been around for a while. Container service, on the other hand, is container-specific, container-driven approach.
Yeah, and that's something where we are trying to focus on the different environments you're monitoring, and so I wonder if is there any kind of monitoring that's being done by the IBM team that the end user doesn't necessarily see, but is a core part of what you're doing?
Yes,
If that makes sense.
absolutely. So for the container service, it is exactly like that today. Actually, this was first presented about a year and a half ago when it actually first became publicly available. And the way we present this as the developer, as the user, all you have to do is nothing. So you just show up, you start a container, and voila, everything you care about starts to show up. Then two key principles we built on top of this is basically, one of them was extensibility that we have been working heavily on since then, because what we see is you can do 80% of common base that people will say this is useful for me, but you don't want to go super sophisticated after that because that just becomes an unnecessary complexity. So you have to kind of get the users familiar with that 80%. Is okay, yes, I understand this is what I want, and this is simple enough for me to digest. Oh, by the way, once people get comfortable, we are always super greedy, right? The next thing is, but this, I need this and I need that as well. And by the way, everybody has their own opinions about how things should be done. So that 20%, we have been working on providing capabilities around how we can give each user their own ability to extend both data collection and what we call kind of data curation and analytics. So they can have their own capabilities just for them, exposed to them, and works only on their data so that they can actually grow this. So completely seamless, completely touchless for the 80%. And once you're comfortable, now you say, no, I want to tinker with it. We have to provide that option as well. So that's what we are working on.
Yeah. Okay. So you say what you're working on. So talking a little bit more about those customers and kind of how this fits into the service for them, is there any specific issues or challenges that you've seen customers being able to kind of overcome utilizing these services and abilities? Are there big roadblocks that people are solving kind of right out the gate?
Oh, yes, I have the subjective answer to that because I believe what we do is great, but at least we have some proof points to kind of back this up. Some of the things that we have seen earlier was there were kind of prescriptive ways of here is how you build a solution around logging or how you build a solution around security. These are the steps that you have to take. And when we removed all this, folks said, actually, one of the things I want is not to do anything, but just tell you to track X, Y, Z. And I want to just see them. So that capability we provided, that came out after a few iterations that people really said, this is not enough. You know, everybody prescribes, right? All vendors prescribe, this is how you do it. I don't want to name names, but I'm sure, you know, when you look at different cloud providers you have, here is how you get to this, and everything else is your responsibility. So what we were able to do is like to say, the common pattern here is, I want to be able to actually extend this by just presenting you what I need in terms of information that you want to track. That's one thing we were able to build. So as our users, for example, are able to specify, I want to track these specific log files and actually down the road maybe configurations. And all they have to do is specify. That is a requirement from their end. The other one, so I think this is one that came up. The other one, containers present an interesting challenge. We haven't talked about this before. You know Docker Hub, probably, right? You have probably pulled from Docker Hub. So there is now great amount of availability, but that comes a lot of accountability issues, because I can easily build a container with certain characteristics that might actually have some exposures in them and provide it in the cloud, and you can pull it and run it without knowing it, because provenance is unknown, ownership is unknown. So for these kind of solutions, if you're actually building container solutions, you don't want to be in the middle figuring out, can I really use this? Is this really okay for me to try? But having a solution under the covers to actually provide that visibility for you. By the way, I actually, before even you were able to run that container, I checked it for you. I looked at its contents. I looked at its DNA. And now I know that, for example, it has some open vulnerabilities, or it has some kind of remote access configuration that you shouldn't really be using. And some of the more recent, a little bit of a, shameless advertising, some of the recent things that we have been working on is actually to look at things that really like frustrate me as well as a person, ignoring all that I am doing in this space. I don't want to learn how to do secure application configuration. I don't want to understand how my SSL cipher protocols have to be. But at least what we can provide today is probably like coming up like any day now, to give the feedback to the user. You, by the way, seem to have configured this well, but you haven't configured this the right way. Here is what you can do. So that I actually start leveraging the value. I start working on building my application, building my solutions, and I kind of share the responsibility with the cloud a little bit better to say, I am assuming you are going to do these checks for me, right? So it is like, I have airbags in my car. I don't every day go and say, okay, are airbags, are you there for me? Right? They are there. I know it. I assume that, and I can concentrate on my driving. So if something comes up, you're going to pop up, right? So that kind of built-in basic like shock absorbers for us to make sure that you can still benefit from this huge amount of, this explosion of availability of resources, and not get buried down to the minute details about, I have to make sure it checks every box. By the way, I'll spend my day just to make sure that I checked all the boxes. Now I can test it for 5 minutes, right? So that is, I think, what we have seen as a unique proposition, that people love this kind of capabilities. I don't think I can name names, but at least like direct feedback we got, people said, this is a small company, we're using this container service and some of this monitoring capabilities. Say, we were actually experimenting with this service, and we realized under the covers, you're actually telling us when our containers were compromisable, and actually blocking us from deployment, saying, do you really want to do that? And we didn't even know this existed. So that little bit of information, we got great kudos from the folks kind of experimented and saw some of this as a great value proposition. So
it sounds like to me that really a huge value proposition here is that the customer's spending less time thinking about how they're going to collect that data or how they're going to collect that information, which, as we've kind of discovered in producing this book, is a lot of considerations there. There's a lot of tools available, and they're not all easily sewn together, especially if you're going to do it yourself, of open source tools. It takes away some of that difficulty, and basically seems to me, it sounds like, lets you just say what you want to get, what info you want to get, and what you want to be told, and what you want to learn. But also, you guys are actually in there. Maybe they didn't say they wanted this info, but you still see it, and you're still surfacing it. And if you see there's a problem, you're going to let them know. And so you use the car analogy here, which is a good one with a service like this, because you're not worried too much about if all the little components in your engine are going to work. You know they're going to work, and you know all those safety features are going to work. And so you can focus on doing whatever you actually want to do with the car. So it kind of segues into a topic we talk a lot about with monitoring, is about how you actually use that info to then go and actually use that data to then go and fine tune your applications or your systems. Would you say that that's one of the big opportunities here for the customers, to then focus on using that info to make improvements?
Absolutely. If you look at the entire spectrum, I think you presented it very nicely. So under the covers, there are a bunch of steps that make up the solution for you, from monitoring to actually kind of some understanding to some actions. So the entire path is something like, you observe, you analyze what you observe, you make some recommendations, and maybe you take some actions. So I think overall, what with containers and some of the techniques we have built, what you can actually manage to do is to provide this entire pipeline and enable hook points for the users to basically both use it and kind of extend it as you wish. So if we kind of see how this all comes together, you have data collection at one end. A lot of people focus on this. Basically, I'll get some basic usage information, some metrics that are very commonly known, and I just emit them. But besides data collection, doing this seamless in a deep manner, as I mentioned, are kind of key properties for us. So seamless as in no intervention required, no headaches, no hassles, it just works for you. And deep meaning there is a lot about an application, a system's DNA. So you basically extract all of them in the best way possible. And from data collection, then deep and seamless data collection, you go to data ingestion, and then what we call data curation, and finally indexing and analytics built on top. So among all these steps, I think two kind of pop out as potential places where you can build useful analytics. One of them is data curation. It actually turns out to be quite an amusing place where you can do a lot of cool stuff. And data analytics, also there is a lot of focus here, but most of what I have seen out there is kind of a lot of dashboarding and some kind of statistical analysis. But curation, I think, is an interesting middle point that we are also trying to expose, where we actually build solutions in that level. And we think is a great opportunity for us and for users to grow. But as data flows through your system, you notice there are a lot of kind of like cloud functions that you can run on your data. To give you few examples. So basically we collect metrics information, configuration information, system information, network information maybe. And as this passes, there are annotations you can do over this data. For example, for any system information is passing, can you actually say, for example, let's say it's a software or it's a package, you can immediately annotate whether it presents any security challenge. For any kind of configuration that is passing, you can immediately say, is this configuration within the range of what I expect it to be? Performance measures, you can actually say, does it present any kind of unexpected change that I haven't seen before? This is before actually you start working on the analytics and churning big data. But as the data flows, you can actually bring this multiple streams. And now on top of that, you can say, now all of this data is available to me. Now I can start iterating over this, building bigger analytics. Now I have all this information. As it flew, it got richer and richer. And at the end, I can build a lot more solutions around operational analytics, about whether my performance measures are within range, my communication patterns, behavioral analysis, whether I present like a botnet behavior or I present like an oversubscribed system, or like performance, security, compliance, bunch of aspects you can start to answer. And the big value is data itself, basically. You have a good way to capture the data, and you have a good way to kind of enrich the data. Now it becomes a playground for everybody to build your analytics on top. I think that is where we will see a lot of interesting things coming up. And you mentioned Vulnerability Advisor. The entire story of Vulnerability Advisor is just that. To give you a simple example of like the kind of evolution of it. Originally, the obvious things that came to mind were, let's build a solution because we already get the data flowing. Just build a data enricher, data annotator that looks at this and says which vulnerabilities are applicable. That seemed like the first iteration. And then it turned out to be users have potential issues with weakly configured remote authentication on their systems. And that turns out to be a relatively easy thing to check before the data actually gets indexed. So we said, let's add another enricher like that. And it turned out to be something, a whole new feature down the road to actually provide a capability. Just one more thing to check at the end. And then now people start to combine these and make policies on top of this, basically apply rules around how to fit their organizational policies to say, these are what is applicable to me. So I'll basically make sure I am aware of these kind of states. And then you combine them and build bigger and bigger analytics. So again, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, yeah. I think we can say a lot of this is obviously condensed. So my question is, you're talking a lot about what customers can expect, I guess. What does the roadmap look like for what you're working on right now? What can we expect and what can customers expect coming in the near future?
Okay, so some of them are easy to answer. So I'll concretely talk about a few things that are coming up. As I said, first generation of logging operational visibility monitoring was around metrics and logs. Since then, we have extended this to configurations and system state information, including things like packages, file system information, operating system information, and application configurations. So these are already coming down the pipeline. Few examples of this that will surface, and all of this actually from, if you look at container service, all of these are kind of under the umbrella topic of vulnerability advisor. So we usually use that as the topic, but we kind of branch out to many things as we go forward. Are things around looking at application configurations. This is a very original solution. As I said, one great example of that is security misconfigurations. This is actually, as of this week, out in production. So Bluemix service now has this capability. One thing in metering is the capability to provide equality between runtime and offline. For containers, this matters a lot because the overall workflow now involves you actually start from code, you build an image, you build a running system. So there are different points that kind of flow, unlike traditional systems where you have a base, golden system and you just like dump new stuff in it. Now you have the entire thing flowing through. So basically providing equality end to end to see that how are things at this stage, in the build stage, how are things at running stage. So we are able to provide this actually, both running containers and offline images have the same fidelity of information. For IBM, this matters. So we provide support for power instruction set images as well as x86. That is now on parity and available. And one more thing that's actually closer to analytics is what we call risk analysis. That is not out there, but it is actually just being worked on. So we have a version running and we are just going to promote it in a couple of weeks. Probably in November, it will be in production. The idea is a lot of the things we did was kind of, as I said, like my mind thinks that, you look at the data, you keep enriching the data, but then we kept doing this. Now at the back end, you give the users a lot of results, but now how can you make sense? How can you prioritize? How can we understand where to attack first? So we are building a solution that we call risk analysis that basically looks at what you have observed, what kind of configuration issues, security issues you have. And on top of that, basically enrich with external information where you have external databases that tell you criticality of certain things, combine them together and give a posture about here are the top issues that you have to address for mitigating your risk. Here are, from your entire organization, here are the top applications that you have to pay attention to. And here are the most prevalent issues. For example, if you fix this, you suddenly fixed like 50 applications or 50 services. So these kind of things, two of them at least, what we call like a base analysis, base risk analysis, and what we call a temporal analysis, which talks about the maturity of this, is about to be available in a couple of weeks. Just this morning, actually, before we are talking, we were reviewing the latest of it. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it shows up. A few more things, and then like longer term things. So as I said, we are very big on looking at just basic resource use patterns. So configuration analysis is one big topic that we are working very heavily on to actually provide capabilities. And this I find as a relatively less trodden path, unlike things like security and metering, because there are few solutions, but not too many. I can probably like recite 20 for security and 100, like we can recite 100 probably for general monitoring and logging. But this configuration analysis, misconfiguration detection and management, this is something that we are kind of adding capabilities as we go down the road and find a very interesting space. As these applications get distributed and more complex, this is where we see a lot of opportunity to grow, because one configuration change in X can actually cause a failure in Y. And they don't need to be like close in time in terms of when they are actually when they happened. They might be close in time in terms of how they are activated, how they kind of came into being effective. So basically doing this kind of analysis is very interesting analytics to do here. They both data collection side and also building analytics on top. A few others, but I'm gonna stop here. So maybe some other time I'll talk.
The configuration analytics, that itself sounds really interesting, and I kind of look forward to learning more about that, because it sounds like a pretty good solution to handling a lot of the complexity that we know that users are seeing. So that's something that I think everyone can look forward to. But John Turk, thank you for joining me. This has been a great podcast. I think we've touched on a lot of really interesting topics. It's a really interesting space, and it sounds like I think we know now. Definitely, they have a lot to say here. So it's very good. I think it's been a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed this as well.
All right, and thanks for listening, everyone. Tune in for a new episode soon. IBM is the sponsor of our ebook series on the Docker and container ecosystem. Learn more about IBM's perspectives in our latest ebook about monitoring and management. It's available for download now at thenewstack.io.